Hello, friends. Welcome to Creative Medicine. In this lecture, we will learn about in the liver, the normal anatomy. If you see the normal weight of the liver in the males, it is 1800 grams, and in the females, it is 1400 grams. Then we have glycogen storage capacity. The glycogen storage capacity of the liver is around 65 milligrams per kg of the liver tissue. The liver has dual blood supply. That means it has and also it has dual blood supply and it also has the capacity to regeneration. So in the blood supply, it receives blood supply both from the 75% of its blood supply is from the portal vein, whereas 25% of its blood supply is from the hepatic artery. So portal vein receives deoxygenated blood uh, despite of the fact that it has 75% of blood supply, and oxygen supply of this portal vein is only 50 to 70%. The oxygen supply of this portal vein is 50 to 75% because of the deoxygenated blood, whereas hepatic artery will supply almost 30 to 50% of oxygen to the patient. Then hepatocellular carcinoma is mainly supplied by the branches of the hepatic artery. And then there is one thing in hepatocellular carcinoma which is done, which is triple phase CT, is actually investigation of choice for hepatocellular carcinoma, where you see three phases, which one phase is non-contrast phase, and then you have arterial phase and you have venous phase. So in this triple CT, you will see arterial hypervascularization is seen with venous washout is seen in these patients. And here you will also see presence of a portal triad is seen. In the portal triad, you will give a Mickey Mouse like appearance. This is common bile duct is seen. Here you will see hepatic artery with portal vein. So this gives an appearance of Mickey Mouse pattern, especially on ultrasonography. Next, if you see the segments of the liver, we have coinoid segments are present. According to this coinoid segments, first he divides the liver into 8 segments based on the portal vein and hepatic vein. So if you see the portal vein, based on the portal vein and hepatic vein, hepatic vein actually has three branches. It gives right hepatic vein, middle hepatic vein, and left hepatic vein. Then if you see the portal vein will give two branches. It gives right and left portal veins. Okay, in this way it is dividing into 4 segments. Mainly it divides into 2 segments, which again divide into total 4 segments each lobe. So mainly the coinoid segments will divide into 2 lobes and 8 segments. So what are the segments? If we name them, this is 2, 3 and 4A and 4B. So this is 4A, this is 4B, 2, 3, 4A, 4B, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, it is 2, 3, 4A, 4B, 5, 6, 7, 8. So if there is carcinoma of gallbladder, where do you see gallbladder? Gallbladder is seen somewhere here. So here you will see gallbladder. If there is carcinoma of gallbladder, it is in direct relationship with 5 and 4B. Right? So in these cases, you will have to remove this right lobe of liver along with 4A and 4B segments. Okay. So what does the right lobe contains? Where is right lobe? This is right lobe, this is left lobe. So here this is the division. So right lobe contains the 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th segments, whereas the left lobe, this is the left lobe, it contains the 2nd, 3rd and 4th and 4A and 4B segments. Okay. Now what about the hepatectomies? So we have hepatectomies. Right hepatectomy, right hemihepatectomy. Right hemihepatectomy will remove only the right lobe. Obviously 5, 6, 7, 8 will be removed, and left hemihepatectomy will remove only the left lobe. So there is 2, 3, 4A, 4B are removed. Then we have extended hepatectomy also. So if there is right extended hepatectomy, it will remove the 4, 5, 7. If there is right extended hepatectomy, it will remove 5, 6, 7, 8, and along with that it removes 4A and 4B also. If there is left extended hepatectomy, in this case it will remove the 4A, 4B 2, 3 are removed. Along with that 4, 6 and 7, sorry, 8 and 6, 5 are also removed. This is left extended hepatectomy. So let me just draw this again so that it becomes easier. So this is the liver. So this is the first division. So these are the divisions. So this is the 2, 3, 4A, 4B and 5, 6, 7, 8. So if there is right extended hepatectomy, in right extended hepatectomy, you will remove these. Number 1, right lobe is removed. 5, 6, 7, 8, and also you will remove 4th lobe also. 4A and 4B are also removed. If there is left extended hepatectomy, in left extended hepatectomy, you will remove the left lobe first. 2, 3, 4A, 4B is removed, and you will also remove this part. That is 5 and 8 are also removed. Okay, and segment 1, which is called as caudate lobe, whereas segment 4, which is present here, this is called as quadrate lobe. Then if you see some important points about caudate lobe or segment 1, this is actually the caudate lobe has 3 parts. One, we have Spiegel's lobe. We have Spiegel's lobe, which is actually the segment 1. Then we have paracaval portion. This paracaval portion is segment 9. One, we have Spiegel's lobe, which is segment 1, and we have paracaval portion, which is segment 9. And then we also have caudate process also. Caudate process also. According to this recent studies, this segment 9 is also available, which is a paracaval lobe, paracaval portion, which is a part of caudate lobe. So this caudate lobe will receive blood supply from both left and right branches of portal vein. Then it also receives blood supply from left and right branches of hepatic, not blood supply, it also receives biliary drainage from right and left hepatic duct, and it will drain into inferior vena cava. So main advantage is especially in Budd-Chiari thrombosis. In Budd-Chiari syndrome, there will be hepatic vein thrombosis. So whole of the liver will be affected, but not the caudate lobe, because caudate lobe mainly it is drained into inferior vena cava directly, so it is not affected. So this undergoes hypertrophy and does the work of all the other lobes. Then what is the disadvantage? Disadvantage is if there is hilar carcinoma. In hilar cholangiocarcinoma, this can involve the caudate lobe early, and as a result, we should do caudate lobectomy is done in this hilar cholangiocarcinoma. Then if you see some important points about the fascial plate, which is around the liver hilus. The fascial plate around the liver hilus is actually a condensation of endo-abdominal fascia around the portal structures. Here you have fascial plate for 3. It is present around the gallbladder, which is called as cystic plate. If it is present around the hilum of the liver, it is called as hilar plate. Then if it is present in the umbilical fissure, near the umbilical fissure, then we call it as umbilical plate. Then we have something called as Pringle's maneuver. Pringle's maneuver is it is total obstruction of the total inflow obstruction. So you will have portal triad. If this is the portal triad, you will hold the portal triad with the hand. Okay, you will occlude the portal triad, and then it will control the bleeding from portal vein, and hepatic artery bleeding will be controlled. But if still after occluding the portal triad, if there is bleeding, then think that it can be due to inferior vena cava or hepatic vein bleeding, because these are not occluded by Pringle's maneuver, whereas portal vein and hepatic artery is occluded by Pringle's maneuver. Next, the disease which is important in the liver is we have something called as pyogenic liver abscess. Pyogenic liver abscess is the most common liver abscess, which is seen in 5th to 6th decade of life, most common in alcoholics, and it is most common organism is E. coli is seen, and here in India it is in world it is E. coli, and Klebsiella is associated with pyogenic liver abscess in Asia. And especially if you see in children, especially with chronic granulomatous disease, it is associated with staphylococcal aureus. So if you see the roots of infection, first there it can occur from the bile duct also, especially if there are CBD stones or if there is hilar cholangio carcinoma or if there are CBD strictures. All these will result in cholangitis, and this cholangitis may spread to liver, causing pyogenic liver abscess can occur. Then if you see, the second most common way is portal vein. Portal vein is second most common route of spread of pyogenic liver abscess, where appendicular perforation can occur, or there can be diverticulitis or appendicular perforation can occur. So this will increase the risk of pyogenic liver abscess. Then we have hepatic artery. Children suffering from chronic glomerular disease, they will have decreased neutrophil function. So this decreased neutrophil function causes increased subacute bacterial endocarditis, and thus the infection reaches the liver via the hepatic artery, and thus leading to formation of pyogenic liver abscess. So one, it can also be due to direct extension of the infection from the pyothorax. From the pyothorax there can be direct extension of the infection can occur, that is from pyothorax, and there can be also subdiaphragmatic abscess here which could have extended into the liver, or it can be some perinephric abscess around the kidney which would have extended into the liver, or it can be due to acute suppurative cholangitis which extends into the liver. Now, if you see the clinical features, the most common symptom is you will see presence of fever with chills and rigors are seen, and the patient will also suffer with abdominal pain, and anorexia, fatigue is seen. In 20 to 25% of cases, you will see jaundice. Here the patient will have fever with chills and rigors, abdominal pain, anorexia, fatigue, and in 20 to 25% of cases, you will see jaundice. So if you see the lab parameters, you will see that there is increased alkaline phosphatase, increased gamma glutamyl transferase, and increased 5-nucleotidase is seen in these patients. Then how are you going to diagnose them? Diagnosis is first investigation that is done in pyogenic liver abscess is ultrasonography. Ultrasonography will help in diagnosis. Then if you were asked what is the investigation of choice, you should do aspiration and culture should be done. Then what is the treatment of choice? In treatment of choice, you will have to do percutaneous drainage should be done. Plus you should also give the patient with systemic antibiotics. So this is about the pyogenic liver abscess. Next, if you see the next important, we have amoebic liver abscess. So in amoebic liver abscess, the next important is we have amoebic liver abscess. So what is this amoebic liver abscess? It is caused by Entamoeba histolytica, and it is most commonly seen in developing countries. Then it is most commonly seen by fecal-oral route. It travels by fecal-oral route, and it is also seen in young patients. And the infective stage of this is quadrinucleated cyst is the infective stage where the cyst will have 4 nuclei. And once the infective stage enters it, undergoes mitosis and it forms octanucleate cyst with 8 nuclei are seen in octanucleate cyst, and it will release the trophozoites are released. That too 8 trophozoites are released. Once the 8 trophozoites are released, these will enter the colon and it forms the flask-shaped ulcers are formed. Then what happens? Then what is the most common location of this flask-shaped ulcers or amoebic colitis or amoeboma is actually cecum, and ascending colon is most commonly affected. Then if you see the Escherichia coli will reach the liver. How does it reach the liver? Via superior mesenteric vein or portal vein, and it causes the breakdown of the hepatocytes, and thus it causes the necrosis of our WBC also. And thus it gives rise to pus which is called as anchovy sauce pus, mainly formed by the necrosis of the WBC and histolysis of the hepatocytes, and this is accumulated. Then if you see the clinical features, if you see the most common symptom here is abdominal pain followed by fever, anorexia, fatigue is seen. Remember that the jaundice here is very rare in contrast with pyogenic liver abscess where jaundice is the predominant feature. Most common LFT abnormality here is increased prothrombin time is seen. Then first investigation that is done here is also USG. USG and CT will confirm the diagnosis. And how are you going to confirm it? Confirm the diagnosis by serology, especially you will do ELISA should be done for confirming the diagnosis. Then the treatment is you can give oral metronidazole. Oral metronidazole should be given at 750 milligrams. TDS should be given for 10 to 14 days. Now, after that, if it does not subside with medical therapy improve, then you should do aspiration. Now, what are the indications for aspiration? If no improvement with medical therapy for medical treatment for 3 to 5 days, then you should do aspiration should be done. Or in high risk abscess, especially high risk abscess, when do you call it as high risk abscess? If it is left lobe abscess, or if the size is more than 5 centimeters, or if there is any diagnostic uncertainty, or if there is bacterial super infection is present. In all these cases we should do aspiration. And in pregnancy, so if there is no improvement after medical therapy for 3 to 5 days, high risk abscess, diagnostic uncertainty, bacterial super infection and pregnancy, you should do aspiration. Next, if you see the treatment of carriers, how are you going to treat the carriers? Carriers are asymptomatic cyst passers are called as carriers. These carriers are actually given paramomycin is given along with iodoquinol. Paramomycin with iodoquinol is given to the patient, or you can also give diloxanide furoate can be given to the patient. And what about the complications? Complications is here there is an abscess in the liver. This can, number one, rupture into the peritoneal cavity. If it ruptures into the peritoneal cavity, it will cause peritonitis. In such cases, you should do laparotomy and do peritoneal lavage, and drain insertion should be done. Sometimes if it might rupture into the pleural cavity also, and in such case you should put an ICD insertion should be done. Sometimes it can even rupture into the pericardial cavity also, where heart is situated. So when it ruptures into the pericardial cavity, then you should do needle pericardiocentesis should be done, followed by pericardiotomy should be done. So these are the main complications of amoebic liver abscess. Then the next important is we have something called as hydatid cyst. In the hydatid cyst, this is a zoonosis which is primarily seen in sheep rearing areas of the world. So it is endemic, especially in Mediterranean countries, that is Middle East and Far East and South America. It is mainly caused by Echinococcus granulosus will cause this disease most commonly, and it is also caused by Echinococcus multilocularis will also cause this disease. Echinococcus multilocularis is responsible for malignant hydatid disease. Okay, it can also be caused by Echinococcus vogeli, and Echinococcus oligarthus can also cause this disease. Then if you see the host, first we have definitive host is the dog, then we have intermediate host which is the sheep, and we have accidental host or dead end host, are also called as intermediate host, or without human to human accidental host, dead end host, and intermediate host is actually man. Here there is no human to human transmission is seen, and it is mainly transmitted by fecal-oral route. So how does it transmit? Once you eat the contaminated food with eggs of Echinococcus, these will result in formation of hexacanth larva will form, and these will penetrate the duodenal capillaries. Once they penetrate the duodenal capillaries, these will reach the portal vein and inferior vena cava. When they reach the portal vein, they will go into the liver. In inferior vena cava, they will go into the lungs and other solid organs. So most commonly, the cysts are mainly seen in the liver, followed by lungs, followed by spleen, followed by kidney, followed by brain, and followed by bone. So cysts are seen in liver, they are seen in lungs, then they are seen in followed by spleen, and then you see them in kidneys, and then you will see them in bones. Okay. Then if you see the clinical features, it is most common in males and females equally. Mostly there are asymptomatic lesions. If it is most common symptom is asymptomatic palpable mass is seen, intra-abdominal mass is seen. So it's most commonly presumed to be, that is hepatomegaly. If you see in symptomatic patients, you will see presence of abdominal pain and discomfort, and also dyspepsia will be seen. Most common complication is intrabiliary rupture is seen in the patient. Then if you were asked what is the first investigation done in this case, is ultrasonography is done. Ultrasonography will show the presence of rosette appearance will be seen, and also you can do CT scan where you see presence of ring like calcification will be seen on CT scan. Then investigation of choice actually is hydatid serology is the investigation of choice, and here you will do ELISA can be done, and you can do ARC5 can be done, and you can also use immunoblot also. So all these ELISA, ARC5 and immunoblot will give almost 95% sensitivity and specificity will be seen. And we have Cassoni test. Cassoni test is obsolete, but it is because of it has low sensitivity and it also can cause anaphylactic reactions. Okay. Then if you see the treatment, the drug of choice for perioperative chemoprophylaxis, the drug of choice for perioperative chemoprophylaxis is albendazole is the drug of choice, followed by mebendazole. In the albendazole, albendazole is actually a scolicidal and it can shrink the cysts. Then the next important thing is surgery. The surgical intervention is something called as Pear technique, where you puncture the cyst, aspirate the thing inside it, then you inject the scolicidal agent and re-aspirate it. The injection of scolicidal agents which are used are, you can use hypertonic saline is used, which is almost 20% saline, and you can use 0.5% cetrimide is used with 0.05% chlorhexidine. Cetrimide is used with chlorhexidine 0.05%. You can also use 10% povidone, iodine can be used. Note that formalin and silver nitrate are not used because of their toxicity. What are the contraindications? If the cyst is inaccessible cyst, or if it is peripherally located cyst, then obviously you won't do. And if the cyst has multiple loculi, multiloculated cyst, or if the cyst has communication with the biliary system, okay, then you won't do. If the cyst has communication with biliary system, it is not done. If there is cyst in the lungs, then it is not done. If the cyst is present in the brain, you won't do it. If it is a calcified cyst, then you won't do it. So what are the contraindications of Pear? Pear is first, if it is an inaccessible cyst, or if it is peripherally located loculated cyst, if there is communication with the biliary duct, or if there is cyst is present in the lung and brain and calcified cyst, you do not do Pear technique. Then you can do cyst evaluation. Cyst evacuation can be done with omentopexy can be done, and also you can also see calcified cyst can be seen. Okay. If the cyst evacuation with omentopexy can be done, and you can also do pericystectomy can be done, where you remove the cyst along with the outside pericyst, you will remove it off. Then you can also do hepatic resection can be done in the patient. Then if you see, there is a classification which is called as Garby classification. According to this classification, type 1 where you see simple fluid collection is seen. Type 1 you see simple fluid collection. Type 2 you see presence of a floating membrane is seen, or undulated membrane is seen, or water lily sign. Then you have type 3. Type 3 where you see multiloculated cyst is seen, and we have type 4 which is complex. Type 4 you will see complex homogeneous cyst, heterogeneous mass is seen. You will see complex heterogeneous mass is seen. Type 5 where you see a calcified cyst. So type 1 you will see presence of simple fluid collection. Type 2 you will see floating membrane is seen. Type 3 you will see loculated cyst is seen. Type 4 you will see complex heterogeneous mass is seen. Type 5 you see calcified cyst is seen. So these are the important points about the hydatid cyst. Now if you see the liver tumors, in the tumors, if you see what is the most common malignancy of the liver, it is metastasis is the most common malignancy of the liver. What is the most common primary of the liver? Hepatocellular carcinoma. What is the most common primary in children? It is hepatoblastoma is most common primary in children. What is the most common benign lesion in children? It is hemangioma is the most common benign lesion in children. Then if you see the liver metastasis, So in the liver metastasis, GIT will develop from foregut, midgut and hindgut. So liver metastasis, if you see the blood, so GIT will develop from foregut, midgut and hindgut. Okay, foregut receives blood supply from celiac artery, midgut from superior mesenteric artery, and hindgut receives blood supply from inferior mesenteric artery. So liver acts as a filter organ for most of the venous drainage from GIT. So if the blood has any malignant cells, it gets filtered in the liver. So if you see, for malignancy of the GIT from esophagus to the rectum, there is hematogenous spread is seen. Any hematogenous spread, it is to the liver. So most of the GI malignancies will metastasize to the liver. And what about the non-GI malignancies? Non-GI malignancies will also go to the liver. The examples are most common site. Non-GI malignancies, most commonly they go to the lungs. Non-GI malignancies, most commonly they go to the liver, lungs. Non-GI malignancies, most commonly they go to the lungs, whereas GI malignancies, most commonly they go to the liver. So what the most common primary for liver metastasis is colorectal carcinoma is the most common primary for liver metastasis. That is, colorectal carcinoma sends its metastasis most commonly to the liver. Okay, and followed by carcinoma lung will also send its metastasis to the liver. Okay, now if you see, the most important tumor in the liver is, we have hemangioma, which is a benign tumor in the liver. Hemangioma is actually a benign tumor of the liver. It is more common in females and it is associated with use of OCPs. It is of two types. We have capillary hemangioma and then we have cavernous hemangioma. So it is usually small. This hemangioma is usually small, less than 5 centimeters in size. If it is more than 5 centimeters in size, it is called as giant hemangioma. And this hemangioma, it increases in size by ectasia, not by neoplasia like other tumors. It increases by size by dilatation of the vessels. Hemangioma will increase the size by dilatation of the vessels. So clinical features is, in clinical features, most of the tumors will be asymptomatic and they are incidentally diagnosed by radiological investigations. Then if you see, so hemangioma is usually asymptomatic and it is incidentally diagnosed by radiological investigations. In symptomatic patients, the patient will have abdominal discomfort and pain will be seen, and it is associated with a syndrome which is called as, we call it as Kasabach-Merritt. It is associated with Kasabach-Merritt syndrome, and according to this syndrome, the patient will have microangiopathic hemolytic anemia will be there, and also there is platelet tapping anemia with consumptive coagulopathy is seen in the patient, and also thrombocytopenia is seen in the patient. So microangiopathic hemolytic anemia with platelet trapping anemia, consumptive coagulopathy and thrombocytopenia are seen in the patient. So if you see the diagnosis, because it is a vascular tumor, FNAC or biopsy is contraindicated. So in these patients, you should do investigation of choice is MRI. This MRI shows peripheral nodular enhancement is seen. It shows peripheral nodular enhancement. Then a treatment of choice in these patients is actually enucleation is done. Now, what about which of the following, where do you see enucleation? Enucleation is actually done in conditions like hemangioma of the liver. You can do enucleation. It is done in hemangioma of liver. It is done in leiomyoma of esophagus. It can be done in leiomyoma of esophagus and chylomymatic cyst and insulinoma of head of pancreas. So enucleation is done in hemangioma of liver, leiomyoma of esophagus, chylomymatic cyst and insulinoma of head of pancreas. Then okay. And what is the diagnosis? Diagnosis is, in this patient you will see MRI is done and treatment of hemangioma is enucleation is done. Then the next important is focal nodular hyperplasia. So in focal nodular hyperplasia, this is the most common, actually second most common benign tumor in the liver is focal nodular hyperplasia. It is most commonly associated with usage of OCPs, and here in focal nodular hyperplasia, one important thing is hepatic architecture is maintained in these patients. Hepatic architecture is maintained in these patients, and if you see the clinical features, these patients are mostly asymptomatic, and because they are mostly asymptomatic, they are diagnosed incidentally. So investigation of choice is CECT, and this CECT gives appearance of central stellate scar is seen in these patients, and this central stellate scar is seen because of the central feeding arteriole and multiple peripheral branches. There is a central feeding arterioles which give multiple peripheral branches, which gives the appearance of central stellate scar. Then if you do angiography, on angiography you will see that there will be abnormal vascularity is seen in the patient, which will give rise to spoke wheel pattern, or we also called as cart wheel pattern is seen on the angiography, because there will be a feeding arteriole giving rise to many small feeding branches. So this will look like a spokes of wheels, so it is called as spoke wheel or cart wheel pattern. Then treatment is, you can do observation can be done in the patient, and you can also excise the lesion. Okay, then we said there is central stellate scar is seen. Now what are the different lesions where you see central stellate scar? Central stellate scar is seen in focal nodular hyperplasia. Then it is seen in fibrolamellar variant of hepatocellular carcinoma. It is also seen in renal oncocytoma. You can see oncocytoma, where you can see central stellate scar, and you can also see central stellate scar in serous cystadenoma of pancreas. You will see central stellate scar is seen. Okay, next, the next important thing is about hepatic adenoma. This hepatic adenoma is a benign proliferative disorders of the hepatocyte. This has low risk of malignant transformation. It is most commonly seen in females and associated with OCP usage. So if you see here, most important thing is hepatic architecture is not maintained in this hepatic adenoma, whereas in focal nodular hyperplasia, hepatic architecture is maintained. Here this is poorly supported by peripheral blood vessels, and as a result there is increased risk of hemorrhage in these patients, and there is increased risk of necrosis is seen in these patients. Here these patients will cause abdominal pain will be seen, and also there will be increased risk of tumor rupture will also be seen in these patients. Then this risk of tumor rupture will actually increase in pregnancy mostly. Next, if you see the clinical features, in the clinical features, the patient is asymptomatic, or the patient can have abdominal pain, especially when there is rupture of the tumor or rupture of the bleeding hemorrhage. Then it can result in, or it can be symptomatic, there can be abdominal pain. And if there is tumor rupture, this will result in the hemorrhage in the patient, and this hemorrhage will lead to shock also. The patient can land up in shock also. Then if you see the investigation of choice is CECT, which shows peripheral hypervascularity is seen in the CECT. Then the treatment is, obviously you should excise the lesion in this case. Then the next important thing is the hepatocellular carcinoma. In the hepatocellular carcinoma, if you see the risk factors of hepatocellular carcinoma, first, cirrhosis leading to hepatocellular carcinoma. The causes of cirrhosis leading to hepatocellular carcinoma are hepatitis B virus, hepatitis C virus, alcohol, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, then primary biliary cirrhosis or chronic active hepatitis. All these will result in hepatocellular carcinoma. Then some metabolic disorders will also result in hepatocellular carcinoma, like we have hemochromatosis and Wilson's disease, and also glycogen storage disorders, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. Then we have porphyria cutanea tarda, citrullinemia, and then we have citrullinemia. and then we have orotic aciduria is seen, and also you see Alagille syndrome. So all these will result in metabolic disorders leading to hepatocellular carcinoma. Then we have environmental factors which lead to hepatocellular carcinoma are cigarette smoking. Then we have alcoholism will be seen, and you will also see presence of anabolic steroids will be seen, and also the one chemical which is thyrotrust. Thyrotrust will increase the risk of cholangiocarcinoma. It increases the risk of hepatocellular carcinoma. It increases the risk of angiosarcoma and also hepatic fibrosis. Then if you see what is the most common primary malignancy of the liver is hepatocellular carcinoma. Then it is most commonly seen in males of age group 5th to 6th decade. Mostly you see hepatocellular carcinoma. The most common cause of hepatocellular carcinoma is hepatitis B virus. But this hepatitis B virus induced hepatocellular carcinoma is decreasing mainly due to vaccination, whereas hepatitis C virus induced hepatocellular carcinoma, this is increasing mainly due to the increased blood transfusions, or it is also increased due to sexual transmission, and also it is increased due to its association with HIV. Then if you see the pathological types of hepatocellular carcinoma, one we have hanging type is seen, and then we have pushing type is seen, and then we have infiltrating type is seen. Hanging type, pushing type and infiltrative type is seen. Hanging type has the best prognosis, whereas infiltrative type has the worst prognosis. And then if you see hepatocellular carcinoma, it has propensity to vascular invasion, and this in the vascular invasion the tumor will invade from the one branch of portal vein. It will invade from one branch of portal vein to another, and thus because it will invade from one branch of portal vein to another, the tumor will develop all over the liver, thus causing multicentric and bilobar spread occurs because the portal vein because the tumor spreads from one lobe to another lobe through the portal veins. Next, this happens because the portal veins are valveless veins. Now, what are the valveless veins in the body? Valveless veins in the body are inferior vena cava, portal veins, superior vena cava, and also Batson plexus and dural venous sinuses are the valveless veins in our body. Then next important thing is, if you see the clinical feature, most common symptom is there is abdominal pain is seen, followed by weakness, weight loss. There is abdominal pain followed by weight loss. And if you see the significant weight loss, when do you call it as significant weight loss? If the weight loss of more than 5% is present for 1 month, or more than 10% is present for 6 months, or more than 20% weight loss is present for 1 year, then we call it as significant weight loss. In hepatocellular carcinoma, there will be other symptoms like anorexia, fatigue, jaundice, tumor rupture will be there, and audible bruit will also be there. And one important thing is presence of paraneoplastic manifestations are seen with hepatocellular carcinoma, like you will see presence of hypercholesterolemia is seen in these patients, which is most common, followed by hypoglycemia will be seen, and you will also see increased erythrocytosis is seen, and hyperglycemia are seen in these patients as paraneoplastic manifestations. You will see hypercholesterolemia, hyperglycemia, erythrocytosis and hypercalcemia is seen. Now, if you see the tumor markers, you have AFP will be more than 20 milligram per ml, and there will be increased PIVKA, which is protein-induced vitamin K absence 2. This protein-induced vitamin K absence 2 is seen in these patients. Then, if you see the diagnosis, what is the first investigation? First investigation done is USG, and investigation of choice is actually a triple phase CT scan, where you will see presence of arterial hypervascularization is seen with venous washout in these patients. Now, next important thing is staging. So, in the staging, we have TNM staging is not used properly. First, we have Akuda staging. According to the Akuda staging, you will see this is remembered as BATA. That is, you will see bilirubin. This has bilirubin, this has albumin. And then T for we have tumor size, and A for ascites are seen in this tumor. This is Akuda staging. Then we have CLIP. staging, that is cancer liver Italian program. In clip there is cancer liver Italian program is seen, which has packed. That means P for portal vein thrombosis. You will see A for AFP and C for child Turcot Pug score you see, and tumor extension will be seen. So cancer liver Italian program is portal vein thrombosis, AFP, child Turcot Pug score and tumor extension are seen. Then we have something called as QP staining. What is this? QP staging is Chinese University of Prognostic Index, which is BA3TA, that is B for bilirubin, A for albumin, ascites will be seen, and also AFP is seen and ALP is seen. It is not albumin, it is ascites, AFP and ALP. Ascites, AFP, ALP is seen. T for TNM staging, and S for symptoms are seen. This is BATS. Okay, that is bilirubin, ascites, AFP, ALP, TNM staging and symptoms are seen. Now, how are you going to manage this? For this, we have Barcelona Clinic liver cancer. According to Barcelona Clinic liver cancer Acura stage, this is based on Acura staging and patient's performance status. If it is an unresectable tumor, then you will go to the palliative therapy. If it is a resectable tumor, then you will do adequate you will see whether there is adequate hepatic reserve or not. If there is adequate hepatic reserve, then you will resect it. If there is no inadequate hepatic reserve, then you will do transplantation is done in these patients. Okay, next we have Millen's criteria. What do you see in Millen's criteria for liver transplantation? Here the tumor size is less than 5 centimeters in size. There will be multiple tumors will be seen of around 2 to 3 in number and size of less than 3 centimeters. And there will be no extra hepatic spread or no vascular spread will be seen in the patients. Then after liver transplantation, the 5-year survival rate will be around 70% in these patients with Millen's criteria. So single tumor less than 5 centimeters in size, multiple tumors of number 2 to 3 and size less than 3 centimeters, and there is no extra hepatic or vascular spread. Then if you see if it is an unresectable tumor, then obviously you will do palliation should be done. So in palliation you can do subcutaneous. So first percutaneous, not subcutaneous, percutaneous. Through the skin you can inject ethanol injection. Percutaneous ethanol injection can be done. Percutaneous acetic acid injection can be done. Radio frequency ablation can be done. Microwave ablation can be done. You can also do cryoablation can be done, and you can also do transarterial chemoembolism can be done. Transarterial chemoembolism can be done. What is this transarterial chemoembolism? This is actually the only palliative method that has survival advantage. In transarterial chemoembolism, you will deliver the chemotherapeutic agent and then you will obstruct the hepatic artery. When you obstruct the hepatic artery, the liver does not get any blood supply. So as a result, the tumor cells which are present in the liver also do not get any blood supply. So the patient will have some survival advantage. So for this the chemotherapeutic agents like cisplatin and doxorubicin are given to the patient. Then if you see if there is advanced and metastatic hepatocellular carcinoma, in this case we should give sorafenib can be given to the patient. The drugs, so this is about the hepatocellular carcinoma. Then there are some drugs which have similar action to sorafenib used in different cancers. Those include imatinib. Imatinib also has tyrosine kinase activity. This inhibits tyrosine kinase and it is a drug of choice in gastrointestinal stromal tumor and CML, chronic myeloid leukemia. Then we have sunitinib. Sunitinib is also the drug of choice for imatinib resistant gastrointestinal stromal tumor, and sunitinib is first line in metastatic carcinoma of renal cell cancers, and sunitinib is also used for refractory and metastatic breast carcinoma. You can use sunitinib. Then we have regorafenib. Regorafenib is the third line agent which is used in gastrointestinal stromal tumor, and vandetanib. Vandetanib is the only drug which is used for advanced and it can be used for progressive medullary thyroid carcinoma is vandatinib. Vandatinib is the only drug which can be used for medullary carcinoma of thyroid. Then we have lapatinib. In lapatinib, it is actually a second line agent for HER2 new palliative breast carcinoma. The second line agent is lapatinib. Then we have gefitinib. Gefitinib is actually used for adenocarcinoma of lung. It is used for adenocarcinoma of lung in females who are non-smokers. We use gefitinib. Adenocarcinoma of lung in females who are non-smokers. We use gefitinib. Then we have fibrolamellar hepatocellular carcinoma. Fibrolamellar variant of hepatocellular carcinoma. This fibrolamellar variant of hepatocellular carcinoma is well circumscribed, non-encapsulated tumor. It is well circumscribed, but it is not encapsulated tumor, but it has a small fibrous stroma is present. It is not encapsulated, but it has fibrous stroma is present with lamellar structures are seen. So it is actually a slow growing tumor which is present in young patients. It is a slow growing tumor present in young patients. Now, one important thing is it is not associated with HBV infection or HCV infection, or it is not associated with cirrhosis. It is not associated with HBV, HCV and cirrhosis. Now, if you see the pathology here, there will be fibrous stroma will be seen. There will be fibrous stroma with lamellar structures will be seen. And if you see the AFP is normal in this patient, and you will see presence of raised neurotensin and vitamin B12 binding globulin will be seen. There will be raised neurotensin and vitamin B12 binding globulin is raised in these patients. Then if you see the diagnosis is investigation of choice is CECT is seen. In the CECT you will see presence of central stellate scar is seen in the patient, and also treatment. In majority of cases it gives good prognosis, and it is the tumor which can be resectable. Okay, next, the next important disease is hepatoblastoma. Hepatoblastoma is actually the most common primary malignancy, which is malignancy of liver in children is hepatoblastoma. It is associated with low birth weight, which increases the risk. And this hepatoblastoma is associated with familial adenomatous polyposis and also Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome. It is associated with familial adenomatous polyposis and Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome. Not associated with hepatitis B virus or hepatitis C virus, metabolic disorders or cirrhosis. It is not associated with any of these. AFP is raised in these patients to more than 90% of patients. If you see the clinical features, it is seen in less than 18 months of age. All patients have less than 3 years of age, and it is seen in asymptomatic palpable intra-abdominal mass is the presentation. The presentation of these patients is asymptomatic palpable intra-abdominal mass will be seen. And if you see the characteristically, you will see presence of thrombocytosis is seen in the patient. Then if you see the most common route of spread is hematogenous spread will be seen, and also most common site of metastasis is lungs is the most common site of metastasis. So in these patients, it is most commonly seen less than 18 months of age and less than 3 years of age, and most commonly asymptomatic palpable intra-abdominal mass. The most common characteristic abnormality is thrombocytosis. Most common route of spread is hematogenous spread, and site of metastasis is lungs. Diagnosis. So if you see investigation of choice is biopsy is the investigation of choice, and if you see radiological investigation of choice is you can do CECT in these patients. Then if you see the management, in the management resection should be done in these patients, but in cases of metastatic disease, if there is metastatic disease, then you can do neoadjuvant chemotherapy, and the chemotherapeutic agent used in vincristine can be used, and cisplatin and 5-fluorouracil can be used. Chemotherapy, you have to do resection followed by neoadjuvant chemotherapy can be done. Actually, first neoadjuvant chemotherapy, which is followed by surgery, should be given. In neoadjuvant chemotherapy, you give vincristine, cisplatin and 5-fluorouracil is given. More than 50% of patients' pulmonary metastasis disappears after chemotherapy. Then the next important topic for today is we have portal hypertension. So what is the normal portal pressure? Normal portal pressure is almost 5 to 10 millimeters of Hg is the normal portal pressure, and 10 to 15 centimeters of saline is also normal portal pressure. Normal portal pressure is 5 to 10 millimeters of Hg or 10 to 15 centimeters of saline. Normal portal pressure is 5 to 10 millimeters of Hg or 10 to 15 centimeters of saline is seen. So when do you call it as portal hypertension? Portal hypertension is when more than 10 millimeters of Hg is the pressure, then we call it as portal hypertension. Universal manifestations of portal hypertension will be, you will see presence of splenomegaly will be seen, and also you will see presence of eosinophilic varices will be seen in the portal hypertension. Then if you were asked what is the most common cause of portal hypertension in the patients worldwide, is cirrhosis is the most common cause of portal hypertension worldwide. Then if you were asked what is the most common cause of portal hypertension in children, it is extrahepatic portal venous obstruction is the most common cause of portal hypertension in children. So the causes of increased pressure can be due to increased flow or increased resistance. Any of these can result in increased portal hypertension in these patients. Okay, next if you see the anatomy, the region where portal vein and hepatic artery mixes, portal vein and hepatic artery, both these will mix in sinusoids. The region where portal vein and hepatic artery mixes is called as sinusoids. These sinusoids are actually surrounded by the hepatocytes, Kupffer cells, and also the biliary tract. They are surrounded by hepatocytes, Kupffer cells, and biliary tract. So if this is the sinusoids, the portal hypertension can be before the sinusoids, that is pre-sinusoidal, or after the sinusoids, that is post-sinusoidal, or it can be in the sinusoids. So based on that, we divide it into three types mainly. First, we'll see pre-sinusoidal causes. In pre-sinusoidal causes, all these are before the sinusoid, so these are splenic causes. So splenic causes include splenic vein thrombosis, or it can be due to splenic atrioventricular arteriovenous fistula. So pre-sinusoidal are splenic vein thrombosis, splenic arteriovenous fistula, and splenomegaly. Pre-sinusoidal causes are splenic vein thrombosis, splenic arteriovenous fistula, and splenomegaly. Then we have pre-sinusoidal but intrahepatic, but that is inside the hepatic but before the sinusoids. This pre-sinusoidal or intrahepatic includes, these can be most common, it is schistosomiasis, which is most common, followed by sarcoidosis, then nodular regenerative hyperplasia, or it can be due to graft versus host disease. Okay, all these are pre-sinusoidal intrahepatic, like schistosomiasis, sarcoidosis, nodular regenerative hyperplasia, and graft versus host disease. Then we have sinusoidal causes. Then in sinusoidal causes, we have liver cirrhosis. The cirrhosis causing sinusoids is caused by hepatitis B virus, hepatitis C virus infection, alcoholic infections, primary biliary cirrhosis, and primary sclerosing cholangitis. All these will act on cirrhosis, will cause cirrhosis and causes sinusoidal and thus leads to portal hypertension. Then we have post-sinusoidal. In the post-sinusoidal intrahepatic. So post-sinusoidal intrahepatic includes hepatic vein now. So that is veno-occlusive disease. Post-sinusoidal intrahepatic is veno-occlusive disease is seen. Then we have post-sinusoidal extrahepatic. In post-sinusoidal extrahepatic, it is Budd-Chiari syndrome which is involved. Budd-Chiari syndrome is involved, and also we have IVC, inferior vena cava obstruction is seen, right hepatic failure is seen, and also you will see presence of constrictive pericarditis is seen. In post-sinusoidal extrahepatic, that is Budd-Chiari syndrome, inferior vena cava obstruction, right hepatic failure, and the constrictive pericarditis is seen. Next, how are you going to diagnose it? Investigation of choice is you do Doppler is done, and this Doppler will show presence of portal hypertension and also you will see presence of varicose veins will be seen, and the DVT and testicular torsion are seen, and varicocele is seen in these patients. Then, where do you see these portosystemic anastomosis? They are seen at the left gastric vein will anastomosis with azygous vein, and it forms esophageal varices, and also superior epigastric vein and inferior epigastric vein and para-umbilical vein. All these will result in caput medusae. Superior epigastric vein, inferior epigastric vein and para-umbilical vein will result in caput medusae, whereas superior, middle and inferior rectal veins will result in varices. Rectal varices are seen, and sometimes you can also see audible bruit can be heard. Audible venous hum can be heard in the caput medusae, which is called as Creuvel here Baumgarten murmur. It is Creuvel here Baumgarten murmur. Then if you were asked what is the most common cause of death in cirrhosis, is hepatic failure is the most common cause of death, followed by variceal bleeding. Hepatic failure is the most common cause of death, followed by variceal bleeding. Now let us learn some important points about variceal bleeding. So if you see variceal bleeding, most common site is in the lower 3 centimeters of esophagus. You will see variceal bleeding. Now, these variceal bleeding will be coffee colored. This is coffee colored bleeding will be seen, and the management is first and foremost you put 2 large IV bore cannulas will be put into the patient, and you will start him on IV fluids. The fluid of choice is Ringer lactate is given, and then the cutoff BP is 100 milligrams, and the hemoglobin should be 8 gram percentage. Indication, then you should give that. The hemoglobin cutoff should be 8 gram percentage. If hemoglobin cutoff was less than 8 gram percentage, then you should give the patient blood transfusions. Then, if you see pharmacology. In pharmacology, the drug of choice for controlling bleeding is octreotide can be given, followed by you can give terlipressin also, plus nitrates can also be given. Then gastric lavage can also be done at room temperature. So gastric lavage is mainly done with room temperature saline. If you do it with cold saline, then this cold saline will cause hypothermia, and thus it causes reversible coagulopathy. So to prevent that, we use room saline. Room temperature saline is used for using this for doing this. We use room temperature saline for doing gastric lavage. Then you can do endoscopy. In the endoscopy, you can do endoscopic variceal ligation can be done, or else you can also do endoscopic sclerotherapy can also be done. Okay, this endoscopic sclerotherapy is easier to perform, but it has an increased risk of esophageal perforation. It is easier to perform, but it has a risk of esophageal perforation. Then you should give IV antibiotics are given for 7 days, mainly to decrease the infections, decrease the hospitalization, and decrease the rebleeding. Very good. If the bleeding is not controlled, then what you do? You will have to repeat the endoscopy if the bleeding is not controlled. Then you can also go through surgical intervention. That is, you can do either jugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt can be done, or you can also give or also you can put any type of shunt. So if when do you do that? You will have to do endoscopy when 2 attempts of endoscopic sclerotherapy or endoscopy is failed. Then you can do this tips or shunt can be put. But if you just think that a patient is in the rural areas, and for doing this shunt he should be transported to the urban areas, but his bleeding is not controlled, then what do? Then you have a tube called as Sengstaken. We have Sengstaken Blackmore tube. Sengstaken Blackmore tube, which can be used for this condition. So here you will put the tube into the patient's, if this is the patient's esophagus with stomach. Okay, this tube has actually 3 openings. Okay, it has 3 openings, and it goes into the esophagus and produces a balloon ear that is called as esophageal balloon, and gastric balloon can be inflated. So when you inflate the First, it is a triple lumen. You will have triple lumen tube. It is a triple lumen and double balloon tube, because you have two balloons and it has 3 lumens. So this is triple lumen double balloon tube. This is mainly used to control variceal bleeding during transportation. First, gastric balloon is used to inflate with 50 ml of air, followed by esophageal balloon where you inflate with 250 ml of air. Only air should be used. Water, saline and contrast are not used. The most common complication of this condition is there can be aspiration can be seen, which is the most common complication. You will have to use maximum of 30 to 40 millimeters of Hg pressure should be used for this condition, for this technique. And every 12 hourly you should deflate the esophageal balloon. If you do not deflate the esophageal balloon every 12 hours, it can lead to the necrosis or ischemia of the esophageal wall because of reduced blood supply. Okay, this is Sengstaken Blackmore tube. Then we have one more tube which is called as Linton's Nicholas tube. Nakalas tube. Linton's Nakalas tube. According to this, this is actually, this is the esophagus with the stomach. Okay, now it has only single balloon. It has 2 lumen. It is double lumen tube. Okay, it has only one balloon, that is only it has gastric balloon is present. Okay, so in this Linton's Nicola tube, it is actually a single balloon tube. It is a single balloon tube where you see the capacity of this balloon is 400 to 700 ml. It is 400 to 700 ml. It is only used for isolated gastric varices only. It cannot be used for esophageal varices. Then the next important thing which we have is transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt. This is TIPS. Transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt. It is actually a non-selective shunt. Here you have two. A shunt will be introduced between the right hepatic vein. So if this is the right hepatic vein, actually this is the inferior vena cava. From the inferior vena cava you will get right hepatic vein. Then you will also have one more vein from the portal vein. So portal vein will come like this. Okay, so portal vein will divide into two, that is right portal vein and right hepatic vein. Sorry, right portal vein and left portal vein. Portal vein will be divided into right portal vein and left portal vein. Whereas inferior vena cava will give two, that is right hepatic vein and left hepatic vein. Okay, now you will connect the two things. You will connect this is right hepatic vein, this right hepatic vein, and this is that this is right portal vein. So you will make a shunt between the right hepatic vein and right portal vein. This shunt is called as transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt. Okay, so the blood from the portal vein directly goes into the right hepatic vein instead of going through the liver. So normally the blood from the portal vein is purified in the liver. That means all the ammonia is filtered in the liver. But the complication is because the ammonia is not filtered, this ammonia can directly reach the brain. Thus it can cause encephalopathy in the patient, which is a deadly complication. This stent can undergo stenosis, causing stent stenosis can occur, or it also can undergo stent thrombosis can also occur in this patient. So this is one thing which you should remember. Then what about the contraindications of TIPS? Contraindications, if you see, of transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt, contraindications are, there are absolute contraindications we have, and we also have relative contraindications. In absolute contraindications are right heart failure or pulmonary hypertension is an absolute contraindication, and we have hepatopulmonary syndrome. Okay, one we have right heart failure, then we have pulmonary hypertension, hepatopulmonary syndrome. Polycystic liver disease is also a complication, absolute contraindication. Relative contraindication of is presence of portal vein thrombosis, hypervascular liver tumors, and encephalopathy is relative contraindication. So the absolute contraindications are right heart failure, portal hypertension, hepatopulmonary syndrome, and polycystic liver disease. Relative contraindications are portal vein thrombosis, hypervascular liver disease, and encephalopathy. Then if you see the indications of transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt, these indications are, this can be used mainly to prevent acute variceal bleeding. You can use it to prevent acute variceal bleeding. It can be used in refractory variceal bleeding. It can be used in refractory ascites or refractory hepatic hydrothorax. It can be used in refractory hepatic hydrothorax, and it is used in Budd-Chiari syndrome, veno-occlusive disease, and it can also be used in portal hypertensive gastropathy. You can use this. So these are the indications of transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt, which can be used in prevention of acute variceal bleed, refractory variceal bleeds, refractory ascites, refractory hepatic hydrothorax, hepatorenal syndrome, Budd-Chiari syndrome, veno-occlusive disease, portal hypertensive gastropathy. It can be used. Now, then we have shunts. The shunts are, we have three types of shunts. One, we have non-selective shunts. Second, we have selective shunts. Third, we have partial shunts. Non-selective shunts are EC fistula. We have side-to-side portocaval shunt. We have interposition graft. We have, and also proximal splenorenal shunt we have. Whereas selective shunt are distal splenorenal shunt, also called as Warren's shunt, is a selective shunt, and we have Inocucci shunt, which is a selective shunt. Then we have partial shunt. In the partial shunt, any shunt with diameter less than 10 millimeters is partial shunt. So first we will see some points about EC fistula. EC fistula is end-to-end portocaval fistula. It is end-to-end portocaval fistula. So if this is the liver, here we have the inferior vena cava. Okay, here we have the inferior vena cava. Then you have portal vein also. You have right and left portal vein giving like this. Okay. Now what happened here? In end-to-end portocaval fistula, portal vein is ligated. The portal vein here you will ligate it, and the distal part is anastomosed to the inferior vena cava. Now this distal part will go and it anastomoses with the inferior vena cava. Okay, it will anastomose with the inferior vena cava here. So this is EC fistula, which is also called as side to side. EC fistula is end to side. Like this is the end side. Like this, the portal vein is anastomoting to the inferior vena cava. It is end to side. Portocaval, from portal vein to inferior vena cava. Shunt. Here pulmonary vein is divided and you will anastomose directly to inferior vena cava. Here there is increased risk of hepatic ischemia because no blood is flowing through the portal vein to the liver. It is only historical importance, not done now. Next, the next important we have is side to side. We have side to side portocaval shunt. In side to side portocaval shunt, here this is the liver and this is the inferior vena cava. Okay. Now this is the portal vein. Even here you divide the portal vein, but the difference is you have divided the portal vein. Now both the proximal part is anastomosed to inferior vena cava, and even the distal part is also anastomosed to inferior vena cava. So what is this? This is actually a side to side. You are anastomosing this to side portosystemic shunt. Okay, even both the proximal part and the distal part both are anastomosed to the inferior vena cava. It is most commonly performed shunt. Here it is actually shunt of choice for refractory ascites. You can do it in Budd-Chiari syndrome and veno-occlusive disease. You can do this. This is shunt of choice for refractory ascites, Budd-Chiari syndrome and veno-occlusive disease. Then you have interposition graft. Interposition graft we have portocaval graft. That is between the portal vein and the vena cava you put a graft. So if this is the portal vein supplying the liver and this is the inferior vena cava which is here. So you put a graft between the portal vein and inferior vena cava. That is portocaval graft. Then we have mesocaval graft. In mesocaval graft, The same thing, the portal vein is actually formed by superior vena cava and splenic vein. Now you will put a graft here. Here this is the inferior vena cava. Now the graft is put between the superior mesenteric vein and the portal vein. Sorry, hepatic vein. Superior mesenteric vein and the inferior vena cava. Graft between superior mesenteric vein and the inferior vena cava is mesocaval graft. Then we have mesorenal graft. In mesorenal graft, from the hepatic artery, from the inferior vena cava, you will have a renal artery coming. Okay, now you will put a graft between the superior mesenteric vein and the renal vein. From the inferior vena cava, you will have a renal vein coming and supplying the kidney. Now this superior mesenteric vein, you will put a graft connecting the superior mesenteric vein and renal vein. So this is mesorenal. So these are the interposition grafts which were put. Then we have the next important, which is proximal splenorenal shunt. There is proximal splenorenal shunt. So in this, what do you do? This is a liver. Yeah, this is the inferior vena cava. Now you will put a proximal splenorenal shunt. Now you have a renal vein combines with the superior mesenteric vein and it forms portal vein, which gives right and left portal veins to the liver. Now this is going to the spleen, okay, to the splenic hilum. Very good. Now you will have to first perform the splenectomy. This is removed. Okay, once you perform the splenectomy, and this you will have a proximal part of this vein. Now you will also have from the inferior vena cava, there will be a renal vein which is coming and it is supplying the kidney. Okay, this is kidney. So you have done splenectomy and you have removed the spleen and you have removed a part of splenic vein also. This proximal part of the remaining splenic vein, this is anastomosed with the renal vein. Now you are anastomosed dating to the renal vein. So this is proximal, that is proximal part of the splenic vein, splenorenal shunt, where you are connecting the splenic vein with the renal vein. So that is splenorenal shunt. This is also a non-selective shunt. Then if you see, we also have selective shunts. In the selective shunts, now we have selective shunts. In the selective shunts, we have distal splenorenal shunt. This is also similar to that. Distal splenorenal shunt. In this, you have a liver first. Okay, this is the inferior vena cava here, and there is a renal vein, and then and this is the splenic vein, which will combine with inferior vena cava to form portal vein, and it divides into right and left portal veins. Now this is the spleen, this is the renal. Now in this condition, you will not do splenectomy. Here you will cut it somewhere here, and then you will anastomose this distal end of the spleen to the renal vein. Okay, you are anastomosing this distal end of the spleen to the renal vein like this. So here in this case, the spleen is saved, right? Spleen is saved and also the blood is shunted. So this is distal splenorenal shunt, which is a selective shunt. Okay, distal part of the spleen is divided and sutured with the renal vein. Okay, next we have Inoguchi shunt. What do you see in Inoguchi shunt? Here you will put a graft between the left gastric vein and inferior vena cava. So there will be a left gastric vein and you will also have an inferior vena cava. Now you will put a graft between the left gastric vein and inferior vena cava. So this is Inoguchi shunt. Next we have something called as peritoneovenous shunt. Where do you do these peritoneovenous shunts? These are actually done in patients with refractory ascites. You will do this peritoneovenous shunt. These include, we have Denver shunt, we have Levine shunt, then we have Minnesota shunt. These are Denver shunt, Levine shunt and Minnesota shunt. Here, these are used in patients having refractory ascites. Valves are present in this shunt so that only unidirectional blood flow should be there. The preferred vein here is Here we prefer right internal jugular vein is preferred for shunting rather than superior vena cava. Then the next important abnormality is we have non-cirrhotic portal hypertension. In non-cirrhotic portal hypertension, we have two diseases. One, we have extrahepatic portal vein obstruction, and we have non-cirrhotic portal fibrosis. So the similarities between them are, in all these there is no ascites, there is no jaundice, there is no encephalopathy, no hepatic failure is present. But in both these varices are present, and also you will see splenomegaly is seen. Varices and splenomegaly is seen in both of them, but there is no ascites, no jaundice, no hepatic failure, no encephalopathy is seen in both these diseases. Next, if you see extrahepatic portal vein obstruction and also non-cirrhotic portal fibrosis, the differences. Extrahepatic portal vein obstruction. So here the problem is in the portal vein. So here there is obstruction of this portal vein anywhere in the course. So mainly the first and second order branches are involved in this extrahepatic portal venous obstruction. Most common site of obstruction is the confluence of superior mesenteric vein and splenic vein and superior mesenteric vein. The confluence is the most common site. So if this is the superior mesenteric vein, this is the splenic vein, this confluence is the most common site of obstruction. This is seen mainly in first to 2 decades of life, and here splenomegaly is present, but this is less common. Whereas non-cirrhotic portal fibrosis, if this is the liver, here the problem is in the here this is the portal vein, okay. Here there will be branches, okay. The problem is somewhere in the branches. The problem is in the branching. So here mainly the third and fourth order branches are involved. Fourth order are involved. They undergo fibrosis. It is mainly seen in second to fourth decade. And here, what are the increasing risk factors of non-cirrhotic portal fibrosis? There is vinyl chloride, arsenic, and copper will increase the risk of non-cirrhotic portal fibrosis. Here, splenomegaly is more common in non-cirrhotic portal fibrosis than extrahepatic portal venous occlusion. Then, the next important disease we have is Budd-Chiari syndrome. So, what do you see in Budd-Chiari syndrome? In Budd-Chiari syndrome, you will see that there will be hepatic venous outflow obstruction is seen in Budd-Chiari syndrome. So the cause of this can be due to hepatic venous thrombosis or inferior vena cava obstructions. Hepatic vein thrombosis or inferior vena caval obstructions causes Budd-Chiari syndrome. So if you see etiology, it can be due to polycythemia vera, where in polycythemia vera will have hypercoagulability because of increased platelets and increased RBC, and this will cause hepatic venous obstruction leading to Budd-Chiari syndrome. This Budd-Chiari syndrome, actually the most common cause of Budd-Chiari syndrome in Western countries is hepatic venous obstruction, whereas most common cause of Budd-Chiari syndrome in India, it is inferior vena caval obstruction. In India, inferior vena caval obstruction causes Budd-Chiari syndrome, whereas in the Western countries, hepatic venous obstruction causes Budd-Chiari syndrome. So if you see the clinical features, you will see presence of ascites will be seen and hepatomegaly will be seen with abdominal pain is the triad. Ascites with, you will see ascites will be seen with abdominal pain will be seen. This is the triad with hepatomegaly. Now, Budd-Chiari syndrome caused by hepatic venous thrombosis. In this, the caudate lobe is paired and this caudate lobe is hypertrophied. And when the caudate lobe is hypertrophied, this will give a sign of central hot spot sign in scintigraphy. It will give central hot spot sign in scintigraphy. It will give. Okay, next, if you see the diagnosis investigation of choice is actually the venography is seen. This venography will show presence of spider web collaterals are seen in the venography, and this is mainly seen in Budd-Chiari syndrome. Then we can also do vena cavography. Vena cavography is done if you suspect inferior vena caval thrombosis, which is the most common cause of Budd-Chiari syndrome in India. or yeah. Then treatment is, we have thrombolysis should be done in these patients. We should do thrombolysis, and we should give anticoagulant therapy should be given. And in most patients, they present to the hospital within only after 2 to 3 weeks. Present to the hospital only after 2 to 3 weeks. Therefore, thrombolysis is not useful in them. Thrombolysis is not useful if they present after 2 to 3 weeks. So thrombolysis should be done within 2 to 3 weeks only. Then in hepatic vein thrombosis, you can do in hepatic vein thrombosis, you can do side to side portocaval shunt can be done in hepatic vein thrombosis. Then if there is inferior vena cava obstruction, then you can do transcardiac membranotomy can be done. You can do transcardiac membranotomy can be done if there is inferior vena cava obstruction. Then if the patient has both inferior vena cava obstruction along with hepatic vein thrombosis, then you can do side to side portocaval shunt is done. Along with that, you can do cavo arterial graft can be put. Cavo atrial graft can be put. Along with that, you can put cavo atrial graft also. Then the next important disease is, we have veno-occlusive disease. So in veno-occlusive disease, it is hepatic venous outflow obstruction actually. So it is mainly caused by endothelial sclerosis in the sublobular hepatic vein or venules. Whenever in the hepatic vein or venules, when there occurs endothelial sclerosis, that will result in veno-occlusive disease. Then if you were asked about most common cause of veno-occlusive disease in Western nations, it is bone marrow transplantation is the most common cause of veno-occlusive disease in Western nations. Other causes include, we have chemotherapeutic agents can be used, like we have cytarabine can be used, then we have thioguanine can be used, and then gemtuzumab can be used, and we have ozogamycin can be used. Then we can also use immunosuppressive agents can be used, like azathioprine can be used. Then if you consume bush tea, consumption of bush tea which contains pyrrolidine. So consumption of bush teas. Bush teas contain pyrrolizidines. They contain pyrrolizidine alkaloid, and this pyrrolizidine alkaloid is the one which increases the risk of veno-occlusive disease. It is pyrrolizidine alkaloids which increases the risk of veno-occlusive disease. So if you see the clinical features, you will see that there will be tender hepatomegaly will be seen in the patients, with hyperbilirubinemia will be seen, and there will be retention of the fluids are seen. According to, there is something called as modified Cetal criteria. According to modified Cetal criteria, that there is tender hepatomegaly, hyperbilirubinemia, more than 2 should be there, and also there should be retention of fluids or weight gain. Retention of fluids or weight gain should be more than 2%. If either of the 2 out of 3 is present within 20 days of stem cell transplantation, then it is veno-occlusive disease. Okay, so that is called as modified Cetal's criteria. So according to modified Cetal criteria, if tender hepatomegaly, hyperbilirubinemia of more than 2, or retention of the fluids or weight gain of more than 2% is seen, and if 2 out of above 3 are present in 20 days of stem cell transplantation, then we call it as veno-occlusive disease. Then in the veno-occlusive disease, the investigation of choice is biopsy, and the management is mainly by doing side to side portocaval shunt can be done. And if the patient has hepatic failure, then obviously you should do liver transplantation should be done in these patients. Then thank you, and thank you for watching.